Hello, it's nice to see so many of you here, and it's finally nice that I can invite you and give you a little tour into my PhD head and what I've been doing since I arrived here at the center. I'm going to aim to do something fairly short, maybe 30, 40 minute max, and then we can have some questions, and then hopefully we can have some discussions. If anything, I think that's the value of the term degrowth, is that it provides a very fertile breeding ground for discussion, so let's use it as such. And if I had to summarize what is degrowth in one word, I would say it's a utopia. And this is why I picked this utopian painting from the end of the 19th century. And what do you see in this painting is characteristic of what you would see in any form of utopian art, that it be a novel or a painting or a song. You see two elements. You see one element of dissatisfaction, what's wrong, and one element of imagination, how it could be otherwise. It's very subtle. Here you know it's a very peaceful depiction, but through what those people do, you can see a critique of what they are not able to do in the society where this was produced. Just be able to pick something freely in a tree like this could be a critique of enclosures of the commons or things like this. So degrowth, of course, is not a literature utopia. You don't have it in one single book. You don't have it in a song or a film because it's very recent. It's rather what people call like a concrete utopia. So let's say it's using the spirit of what people call like utopianism. So using utopia as a mode of thinking. And the way I like to describe it is really utopia as defamiliarizing the familiar as a process of estrangement. So basically you create an ideal society somewhere in the future or somewhere in space, and it is from the perspective of that society that you look back into the present. And this is really the nature of backcasting. So you imagine something better and you ask yourself, what do we need to change today in order to get there? And I think it is critical today, at a moment where I think many of us agree, are suffering from some forms of crisis of political imagination, where we have very much troubles to imagine our way outside of capitalism, outside of productivism, consumerism, the global economy, and so forth. Utopianism can provide us with the critical distance to think our way out of this, to judge what is happening today, not in light of just what was possible in the past, but in light of what could be and what should be. So, one utopian scholar I quite like is talking with the utopias as the education of desire. So for me, when I reflect on the history of degrowth in the last 2 decades, it's really what it has been doing this, creating dialogues for people to educate their desires towards something they did not know they want, or they did not know how to really structure their desires towards. But let me start with a quite analytical, a quite like ontological claim here. One assumption underlying all the work I've been doing in the thesis, that there are two ideal typical way of thinking. Ideology and utopia. Blue pill, red pill. And the difference, those two things, they're in essence precisely the same thing, like an ontology plus an ethos. But what makes them different is their function in relation to social change. Ideology is basically what legitimates the system as it is, okay? So an ideological thought is the blue pill, is the thing that will hide some desires and you decide you want to live in the matrix. And utopia is the opposite, is a subversive thought, something that wants to overthrow the system. And what I'm arguing in the thesis is that actually the history of human societies can be understood as a dialectical movement in between ideology and utopia. So every time you can think of any revolutionary change at the imaginary level, not at the real level, in the social imaginary, you have basically one ideology that is being overthrown by utopia. So ideology is always singular in the sense of for every specific situation, there's always one frame, one paradigm that is a bit superior to the others, and it gives birth to a set of alternative utopias. And of course, when one utopia just overthrows the ideology, it becomes ideology and gives birth to a new set of utopias. That's why it's dialectical. And what I'm arguing in the thesis is that the state of sustainability right now can be understood as a struggle in between what I call growthism as a prevailing ideology. I don't call it capitalism because it's not only capitalistic, it's also productivist. I don't only call it productivism because it's also extractivist, consumerist, and a bunch of other things. So I think economic growth, for what I will explain later, is a good symbol of what the system we have now is based on. So growthism as an ideology, and of course we have a diversity of counter-ideology, what I call utopias. And what I'm going to try to argue in this lecture is actually that degrowth as a specific utopia is a promising one to topple over the ideology of growth. I started this work by writing a history of the concept of degrowth, and I was really trying to find a starting point and an end point. And let me just check roughly, okay. And degrowth, I ended up deciding, I think could be traced back to the revolt of May '68. I don't know if you guys know what this was about. Those are the pictures on the top, but it all started in one university in Paris where a bunch of students started to occupy a building as a form of revolt against imperialism, the war that were going on, the colonialism of France, and anti-capitalist reform overall. And this turned into like a movement of national proportion and just the biggest wild strike in the history of France. And here you can see the guy with the microphone, and I think in this breeding ground, like people brought, whatever intellectual tools were available at the time. Some Marxist thought, some anarchist, early feminist thought, and they tried to make a soup out of this and try to see a more desirable future. And that's for me when degrowth was born, or not degrowth as a term, as I will explain after, but just the kind of like the preparation for this education of desire that took the form of degrowth. And I ended my history with the Yellow Vest movement, which is precisely, for me, very close to May '68. At least it's one of the biggest movements since May '68. And you can see the pictures, you can find are very alike. Like in any utopia here, we have those two elements: revolt against the system as it is, and imagination, trying to imagine how it could be. So very quick history of the concept of degrowth in itself. The first time it was used was in 1979. It was two Swiss philosophers that wanted to translate the work of Nicolas Georgescu-Roegen. Not the full work, they just selected 5 essays, translated in French in a short book, and they were looking for a title. And they called it Demain la décroissance, tomorrow degrowth. And they used décroissance to translate Nicolas Georgescu-Roegen in his work. If you've read him, he's talking with like declining state in the sense of the classical economist and of course with the entropy twist. But they call it décroissance. And it stayed pretty much there back then. It was just a word that nobody really picked up because in French it's a synonym for decrease. So décroissance makes sense if you read Georgescu-Roegen, where society is just like constantly increasing our consumption of things. What we should do is actually do the opposite, décroissance, stop there. But in 2002, actually in between those 2 decades, of course, there's been a tiny bit of scholarship, but nobody really picked it up. In 2002, there was this big conference in Paris called Unmake Development, Remake the World, that gathered all the blooming post-development, so critic of development scholars just came there. And there was this very interesting publication in March where people coined this term sustainable degrowth. In just one little magazine, a little issue, and what those people argued is that if we follow the Brundtland definition of sustainable development, actually we cannot call it development because the rich country or just, overusing all the resources at the expense of everybody else, blah, 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 blah. So we should call it what it is. It's sustainable degrowth for the developed country. So, and this caught on a lot. So people just, that actually just, this is the starting point for the movement. It was just like first a book, a couple of key texts, and that's what I traced in the history, went to Italy and, spring the whole movement there. Same in Spain, same in Quebec, same in Belgium, same in Switzerland. Every time following the same thing, a couple of key authors being translated, and the idea of sustainable degrowth. This time not only only decreased, but something else. And then the third phase is when it was translated in English. The first international conference in Paris in 2008, so they translated it as degrowth. And ever since, every 2 years, there's been an international conference in different countries, and now degrowth has become a field of studies. I mean, degrowth studies a scientific concept. There's been political movements in several countries, so it became something. And that's my first claim. What I discovered in writing this history of degrowth in those three phases is actually that degrowth, the meaning of the term, evolved. And here, if you understand this, that dissipates most of the misunderstandings that we have today about the term. So that is my attempt at clarifying what degrowth is and what degrowth is not. So as I said, in the 70s, people were using it as only one denotation. Degrowth as a synonym for decline. It makes sense. We know it. You cannot have infinite growth on a finite planet. So at some point, if you're just beyond your carrying capacity, the carrying capacity of your environment, you just need less. Okay? This is fine. First denotation, environmental necessity. But in 2002, the new denotation came, and what people realized, it's actually just there is no point advocating for less in a society that culturally glorifies more. So they realized actually that growth was a bit of an ideology with not only like physical infrastructure, mental infrastructure, the way the banks are designed, the way jobs are being created, the way the pension system works. So they say, wait a second, okay, degrowth is not only less, but it should also be this emancipation from the objective of growth. And that was the second denotation. Back then, they were making a play of word on between décroître in French, which is to decrease, and décroire, which is to unbelieve. So for them, second denotation, we need to unbelieve in the religion of growth so that we can actually reduce the amount of resources we consume. But then they realized that it's not too sexy to just oppose the system and propose nothing else and say, the religion of growth and capitalism, blah, 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 this does not mobilize people. And that's where the third denotation came. And that started really when degrowth became an English word, where they say, let's not focus too much on the system we have to oppose. Let's focus on this desirable society, what we could get through this emancipation. And here you see this really when it became a full utopia. And that's really the third denotation of it's not only degrowth of something, the economy, consumption of resources, global trade, denotation 1, not only degrowth from something, capitalism, development, the religion of growth, but it's degrowth towards something, for more equality, for participatory democracy, for ecological sustainability. You see where it's a bit of the same, but phrased differently. And I would say right now, to really understand degrowth, it's those three denotations together. Often in the literature, you see people that only refer to one or another. If the three are not present, it is not degrowth as is currently being understood by degrowth scholars. It's actually a misreading of the term. So here, because I wanted to test this hypothesis, so I collected as many definitions of degrowth as I could, which I gathered about 60. And what I did is I looked at Wikipedia pages from when the term was created in all the languages where it exists that I can read, so Italian, Spanish, French, and English, how it was defined when they opened the Wikipedia pages, and how the definition changed. And actually it matches those three phases. So you see first, degrowth, they always define it's less of something, environmentally, da-da-da. And this, after 2000, they had the denotation of it's really against capitalism, and at the end they had the third denotation, and it fits. So here you can see a couple of recent definitions. And I've put in different colors the three different denotations which you can see. The one at the top is the most cited definition. It's a bit scary, but like in every single degrowth article, you get this goddamn definition from 2010, which I don't think is a particularly good one, because maybe it's missing the second denotation, which you avoid often because it's the one most easily to disagree with. And I think like revolution does not sell too much, although, except if you're French. So, okay. Now I have not told you actually what degrowth is, or what kind of utopia precisely it is. That was the second step in my work, and that's what I'm going to talk about now. So, conceptually, I decided to define degrowth as a process of de-economization. That's an ugly word. If you have a better one after I present what it is, you just tell me, because I don't like one. And to understand this, what de-economization is, you see, it's just not even practical, is that degrowth is a response to a historical anomaly, namely like the disproportionate rise in importance of the economy in comparison to its surrounding social and ecological supporting system. So for me, economization, you can understand, is the spread of the economy. So when your apartment, which used to be your home, now you can just rent it to strangers on weekend through Airbnb, it means the economy has somehow expanded. Some people say also it's a process of commodification, right? What was a thing now became a commodity. And that's the expansion aspect, and there's also an acceleration aspect. If you just rent your apartment on Airbnb once a year, okay. But if you rent it like, okay, it depends, I'm just saying, but like over time we see that you can also rent it every week. So then not only the economy expands, but it accelerates. And this critique that degrowth make is that actually the fundamental problem we have today with the economy is one of disproportion at the scale and desynchronization at the speed. So the economy we have is too big and too fast for its social and environmental supporting system. And so basically de-economization is a reversal of this, kind of like slowing down and shrinking down the economy so that it can fit within its society and within its environment. So I'm going to show you how I think it could be done. Basically, it involves two processes. So I keep with this Freudian Marxist division between the real practices, the things we do, the flows of energies, of material, and the imaginary, the social imaginary. This is not only imagination, you know, as fiction or what, but like what we think, ideology, all of that. I mean, in my framework, it's the dialectic between ideology and utopia. So the first movement of de-economization is escaping the economic as a worldview. So the way we think about stuff. So when I think about my home, if I'm thinking like, oh well, you know, I could, if I were to repaint, I could actually, you know, rent it for 12 euros more on Airbnb. I'm purely within an economic imaginary. I'm thinking about maximizing profit. It takes three forms in the current economy. Government try to maximize GDP. Firms try to maximize profit, and individuals try to maximize income. What this is the primacy of financial incentives over other forms of incentives, namely social and moral. And of course, so the economization would be financial incentives becoming more and more important in every decision you make. Like, oh, we could start this company and making this, you know, this very useful product, but it's not going to be profitable, even though it's real good. Here you see the financial incentive is overpowering the other two, which I would argue is what we have today in many sectors. Degrowth is changing this. So if we think in terms of embeddedness, if we want an economy in society, in nature, we need to have financial incentives embedded in social incentives, embedded in moral incentives. And so that's what needs to happen in our heads. What needs to happen in reality is a shrinking and slowing down of the economy. And by this I mean the realm of market exchange. And it's quite simple. It's just reducing the scale and the speed of the economy. The scale I think I won't need too much effort to argue here that the scale in the sense of the amount of stuff, for example, the amount of materials we extract every year or the amount of carbon we release in the atmosphere is too big. It's just too numerous, too voluminous. So we need to do less of this. And the speed is also important. Those two, it's difficult to divide in scale and speed. Here I do this really to expose, because I want to make another point about, like, it's not only on the sustainability aspect, it's also on the democracy aspect. So if you have a global economy where every single, like, the way a cup is produced involves, you know, I don't know how many countries over this, it's impossible to make a democratic decision about the conditions or the number of cups that are being produced. So for this, we would actually need to have a smaller economy where we know the stakeholders, we can be in face-to-face dialogue and do this. The speed is just the same. I mean, now we know, like, that the economy should run as fast as the biosphere can. That is like an absolute biophysical speed limit to economic life. And the second one is, I think the economy should run as fast as democracy can. When in 2008, the financial system crumbled down, decisions had to be made. There was no time to do like we're doing now in France with the Yellow Vest movement, to sit down, open a website, ask people what they think for 3 months. No, decisions had to be made in a week. So I think this really shows if you need to make a decision in a time where there is no need for democratic consultation, it's just that the economy is running too fast. So you need to slow it down so we can match with the pace of democratic deliberation. That would be my argument for this. Slowing down, shrinking down. Of course, I'm not advocating for a total exit of the economy and no more markets, no more money, no more private property. All of this is quite more subtle than this. If we agree that this is a scale and a speed limit, then we just need like a smaller economic mind in a smaller and slower economic body. So again, I really like this concept of proportion. Like if you have a market that is only on Saturday morning in your village for vegetables and fruit, you know, those type of things, it's very difficult to argue that this is represented like a symbol of capitalism and should be abolished just because it's a market. No, maybe this is embedded within the society and the environment where it happens. But most markets today are not. So the analogy I take is, it's like a game, really. I think at some point in time, we realized that playing the game of economy, that means quantification, commodification, privatization, marketization, and assigning different roles. You know, I'm the buyer, you're the seller, I'm trying to maximize my profit, you maximize your utility. All those kind of games we play when we get into the supermarket and compare prices, actually, it performs some social utility. It just maybe saves time. It's a good way of organizing. So here, I think there is a purpose in keep playing that game, but we should remember that it is a game. So right now, the problem is that the game of economy has colonized the game of life. There is no inside and outside the economy anymore. Right now, are we inside or outside the economy? I don't really know. If I receive a notification on my phone telling me that someone's renting my apartment this weekend, so I'm both like a buyer, or I'm like a seller, but I'm also a buyer because maybe I'm consuming some electricity. What roles are we playing? What I'm arguing here is that we actually should replace the game of economy in time and space, and there should be a definite inside and outside. So when I go to the supermarket to buy my things, maybe I'm a consumer for a little while, and maybe I play the price signal. But at the end of the day, when everybody closes shop, it should not matter whether you're a beggar or whether you're a trader. You become human beings, and in the light of democracy, people that should have equal voices. So we should not drag around the result of how successful we were at the game of economy at all time. It should not burden down our identity and our future. So what does this really mean? Here comes the highly jargonized theoretical slide. And so DeEconomization, that's the process. So we reverse the trend and we shrink and scale down the economy. But how would such an economy look like? And what kind of values do we use to navigate ourselves towards this transition? So here my my addition to what's currently exists in the degrowth literature, which is people basically having this constellation of concepts that are very disarticulated, I wanted to clearly define a set of moral principles that underpins the idea of degrowth. What would a degrowth society look like? And I ended up choosing those three: autonomy, sufficiency, and care. It's quite a shrink down because I started with 22. So I think those are the most fundamental. And if you think that it sounds very much like the liberté, égalité, fraternité of the French Revolution, please keep it for yourself. There is no relation whatsoever. So now I'm going to, and what I wanted to do is, of course, not only underpin the moral principles, because that's not what we currently need on the ground, is to say, okay, what type of economy would fit to those moral principles? So what kind of financial incentive will be compatible? What kind of social incentives would be compatible to this moral basis? And that's what I did using this, this classic division of the economy as 5 acts of provision. So I've got here a very broad definition of what economy is: extraction, production, allocation, consumption, disposal. And what I've tried to do in the thesis is to basically detail of what we're doing right now in all of these 5 acts, both on the real and imaginary. So for example, when I'm assigning to every one of those acts a specific ideology, sub-ideology to growthism, to be specific: extractivism, productivism, capitalism, consumerism, and obsoletism, as I called it. And then I'm just defining what would be the opposite from the perspective of degrowth. So this part in my thesis is about 100 pages. So I'm just going to maybe just like pick and choose on a couple of things. And first, those 3, because I mean, if you hear autonomy, sufficiency, care, I mean, who's going to disagree with those? But I had to make stark choices and define them in a very specific manner, which I think many will disagree with. So, and what I call this together, and this we can discuss, I completely evacuated the concept of sustainability and the concept of happiness from this framework. I say it should be about social ecological justice. That's the concept I'm using. And I'm defining social ecological justice with the presence of those 3 things: autonomy, sufficiency, and care. And for me, sustainability and happiness are emerging properties. For example, if you do not, like care is a principle of non-exploitation. If you do not exploit the environment, then as a resulting, you have ecological sustainability. So here I'm really trying to get to the root of it. Not to solve like just the environmental problem we have, but to put an end to patterns of exploitation at the source that leads to environmental exploitation. So autonomy is a principle of collective freedom. Sufficiency is a principle of distributive justice. And care is a principle of ethics based on non-exploitation. So a couple of words on each. First one, autonomy. So the most common phrase in the degrowth literature is decolonize our imaginary. That's what every degrowther repeats, like the goal of degrowth is to decolonize our imaginary. And what this means is basically to regain, like, okay, our imaginaries may be colonized by certain desires we don't want. You know, this expectation that happiness is more consumption of manufactured product, that working more, you know, is a social duty, blah, 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 all those type of things. How do we know that they are self-reflected choices coming from ourselves? This is why we need to define a concept of autonomy, so we know we decolonize our imaginary by making the difference by the type of belief we want to have and we think are fair, and the one that actually we should reject. So it's kind of a recipe for revolt, if you want, autonomy. So let's start with the opposite of autonomy. I define the opposite of autonomy as domination. So quite simply, like more precisely, social alienation. So social alienation is when you feel estranged by your own choices. So you feel you're not the commander of yourself. You're not driving, but being driven. Okay? So for example, if I'm buying a house because I know prices are going crazy, I know it's It's like makes no sense to rent for your entire life, this. But maybe I don't want to buy a house, maybe, you know? And then you could say that I'm being driven by certain social dynamics that is maybe outside of myself. So in the literature, they call it heteronomy. So autonomy is when you're autonomous. Heteronomy is when you're being driven by something outside of yourself. Gramsci called it hegemony. It's something else. Hegemony is when, you know, the menu of options in life is determined by someone else. They tell you can do whatever you want. It's either this or that. That's what hegemony is. It's a reframing of choices. But where does autonomy come from? And that was, here I'm using French existentialist philosophy, Simone de Beauvoir, Jean-Paul Sartre. Also like something that was very present in the revolt of May 68, in saying that autonomy is an active attitude. It's not an attained state. Autonomy is the mechanics of rejecting all form of authority. I know the people that you know me, you kind of understand that I've been walking the talk when it comes to this principle. So imagine this, you know, like autonomy as self-institution. You start by just being skeptical of every belief that is, and then you pick the belief that you think you should have. It's all a matter of never accepting something, never taking something for granted just because others do it or what, you know, you just go on holiday in Thailand because that's what people think to be. No, you can go on a holiday in Thailand if you decide, you know, if you make this decision autonomously. And then this is individual autonomy, nothing too fancy here, you know, critical thinking, the good old like Socratic ideal of reflective enlightened life. And then this turns into collective autonomy. Once we have this, we can be, you know, individually autonomous. A congregation of autonomous individuals can deliberate and make decisions that can be considered collectively autonomous. This is the idea of direct democracy or participatory democracy, which is very big in degrowth. So for me, I'm using this concept of autonomy to justify the choice of participatory democracy as a political system. Justice, I'm going to go a bit faster. Okay, justice, nothing fancy here. I'm saying it's not about resources, not about money, it's not about happiness. It starts from human needs, Max Neef, fundamental human needs. And like, if we want to redesign a society and to clear our imaginary from those things, like about like money is good and certain resources, we need to start from a stable core of what it means to be a human. So I start from needs. Of course, we need to consider present and future generation. Once we have that thing, which they call in the literature the currency of justice, that thing that is supposed to be redistributed fairly, which I argue are capabilities to satisfy human needs, we need to decide who are the recipients of justice. Here, it's very uncontroversial to say it should be not only people of the present, but people of the future as well. So I argue this, and then you need to find a distributive rule of justice. What tells you that is a just distribution? And then I'm using a concept that is called sufficientarianism. Sounds fancy, and the literature and philosophy on this is unreadable, but if you've seen Kate Raworth's Donut, you see what I mean. Sufficiency is basically this rule of justice where everybody should have enough, above a social minimum, okay? But no one should have too much. So for me, like, sufficiency is this living space in between a social minima and an ecological maxima. Nothing fancy either on the justice side. The care is a principle of ethics, of, you could say, non-exploitation, non-violence. I oppose, and I'm saying, you know, care, like, exploitation is the opposite of solidarity. In the sense of, like, I think I'm not going to get into the detail here of, I'm defining what exploitation is. But if you have questions on this, we can get back. I think the way I define it is the way it rings to most definition, you know, like exploitation is where I use someone that is in a vulnerable state for my own advantage at the expense of that person. Solidarity is the opposite, is when I actually sacrifice something of value for myself to help someone that is vulnerable. So I'm arguing today most of our economy works based on a system of exploitation. So we should do a bit more solidarity, and I expand not only solidarity towards humans, solidarity towards non-humans, and this is what I call stewardship, using the wonderful work that has been doing by some colleagues here on that concept. So, okay, I'm going to I would love to talk more about this aspect, but I'm a bit we can maybe get back to it in the discussion, because that is really the meat of my research as an economist, of just explaining how the economy would work in this particular degrowth setting. But maybe I say one thing per aspect. Extraction is, again, there's nothing fancy here. I mean, Herman Daly, the American ecological economists, said it already in the 70s. To have ecological sustainability, we need to have those specific rules of never extracting more or faster than the speed at which an ecosystem can replenish itself. So far that would mean we need to, here it's a little decrease, we need to decrease the rates of extraction, the way we rely on certain materials and energy. Productivism, here, like that, where it connects to Jen's work, is when you look at productivism, which is, you could say, is this ideology, this drive to consider production as a good in itself. Whatever we produce, it's good if you have more. You know, if I could write this thesis in 2-3 years instead of 4, you know, that's a good thing, because I'm more efficient, I'm more productive. It doesn't matter what you produce. It's a cult of productivity, you could say. And when you have a not-for-profit business, you make sure that actually the organization of the business cannot be ruled by a drive for productivity, because you have a social ecological mission. I say it's not anti-productivism. This is decommodification. That's the important aspect. So once you've produced something, we put it on the market. All of this, they interact. The opposite of commodification, so of using the market as a means of allocation, is commons. I mean, there's two options, actually. Either you have a commons or you have a public system of allocation. And what I'm arguing is today, of those 3 forms of allocation, in capitalism, the prevailing one are markets. And what we should have more is more public, let's say, public clearing out spaces for those little commons, which they are interesting because they are the economic form that is most likely to be directly democratic, because they're small, face-to-face interaction, very embedded in the specific ecosystem and social culture where they happen. Consumerism and anti-consumerism, well, that's the whole culture we have built about like more is better, and that more and that well-being or the satisfaction of human needs relies on the purchasing of commodities. I mean, right now, if you want to rent an apartment, so just, you know, have shelter without using money, it seems just completely unthinkable. Same for food, type of thing like this. And so it's a matter of just like consumption in the broad sense of like being able to access goods and services that help us to satisfy our needs in a way that is not completely embroiled in an economic logic. Disposal is also a classic in ecological economics. Of course, you cannot just, everything comes from nature, and once we're done with them, comes back to nature. I realize this is way too short. What I can just give you is a little taster of this. If you've seen terms that you find interesting, I've picked them carefully. We can discuss them. And I'll come back to this picture in the discussion. Now I can come to a fun part, because I think it's not, you know, I cannot come and define degrowth like everybody agrees on it, because as you know, it's a real shit show. Like people are just, it's a very controversial term. So I did like a controversy analysis with the method is called cartography of controversies. You make a map. It's Bruno Latour that developed it in the 90s. And what I found interesting with Bruno Latour's map, controversy mapping, where basically you just keep track of like a disagreement and how it evolves using like actor network theory tools, is that actually that's where you can see ideology. Because ideology and utopia, they're invisible because they live in the social imaginary. But once you disagree, imagine it's a bit like 2 rocks in the dark being brushed, and you see a spark. That spark, it's the controversy. And in looking at this controversy, you can see perfectly the interaction between ideology and utopia. So I've been tracking all these agreements. Here's a bit of the insult that they use against degrowth. I've put in red my favorite. So as you can see, there are people that are really critical towards the theme, which is perfect to start having a dialogue. People that consider degrowth the most natural thing in the world, and others like an heretic medieval demand for just, you know, a global sharing of poverty or of misery. And, well, of course this is evolving. What I've been trying to do is just to divide this into this what is stable, and over time to track, you know, what kind of controversy ends into an agreement that then become a core in degrowth. For example, participatory democracy. Now it's not controversial. If it's not participatory democracy, it's not degrowth. Same thing, if you don't have ecological sustainability, it's not degrowth anymore. Simple. So that's the stable core. Then you have some controversies about population, immigration, the role of technology, the role of the state, all of this, how much markets you should have. And then you have the certain thing that, you know, degrowth is completely not. Ecofascism, for example. Survivalism. This is outside. And of course, there are transfer. Sometimes something can become a controversy and stable core. In time, it happens. So here's what I found in my little controversy analysis. And I think those will provide the basis for discussion. So here I'm already giving you the tools of how to completely criticize degrowth, which, if degrowth is a utopia, I think is as valuable to user creativity to imagine how much it could turn into a dystopia. This is what I've tried to do here. But first, what I've discovered is that degrowthers have been terrible in explaining what degrowth is over the years. And since it was just coined like in 2002, sustainable degrowth, and every time it arrives in a country, you see the same misconception. It's almost sad, you know, and when I was writing the history, it repeats itself again and again and again. Those ones saying like, oh, we don't want degrowth because we've tried it, you know. We've tried it in 1930s, we've tried it in 2008, we've tried it in Greece. It's like degrowth is not a recession. I mean, we have words in economics for this. We actually call it a recession or a depression. So it's not negative GDP. Then the other one, I like this one. It always comes up in questions where they'll be like, well, so you're so degrowth, eh? But what about like the growth of trees? Once I had someone that told me about the growth of fetuses. I was like, so then I always answer the same thing. I was like, okay, well, you know, are you for the growth of crime and those type of things? I mean, I think that's, so, but this is why now I've stopped using the word degrowth as a synonym for decrease. If something, you know, shrink, decrease, diminish, an economy can either grow or can be in a, that's positive GDP, can stagnate, zero GDP, that's secular stagnation. Negative GDP is either a recession, or if it's long-term, a depression, or an economy can embrace degrowth as this ideology I've just described. To clarify, well, the technophobe and anti-science, back to the cave, back to the candle, all those type of things. Perhaps a bit of a short conclusions, because the stance, and we can discuss this, but I think if we come back to this collective autonomy core principle, any technology that is non-exploitative and that is being democratically accepted by a community then is compatible with degrowth. That can be Facebook, that can be agroecology techniques, but it's not like a bundle either. We reject the entirety of modern technology or we accept everything. It's just you get the right to choose. Right? Retrograde and reactionary, you imagine austerity, well, often is this. Authoritarian, also I think a lot of criticism of ecofascism, which I think is a bit of a cheap critique, because again, like the concept of autonomy is like in the literature quite clear about this. Apology of poverty is the most difficult. I have to say that now, like, people are saying, well, look, if you argue for degrowth now, what about the eradication of poverty? What about like people in the world that maybe relies on foreign aid from rich countries and that rely on imports from rich countries? All of those arguments, which required some efforts to solve and compatible with capitalism, I think that's a big misconception, as I've argued. And this is a big mistake, mostly made by sustainability scientists, actually, where they're like, oh yeah, but, you know, maybe, like Tim Jackson even falls into that trap. And they're like, yeah, but it's a different form of capitalism, you know, it's a bit special. I'm like, what is this? Like, I think we should call a cat a cat. If it's got like 1 molecule of carbon, 2 molecules of oxygen is CO2, you know, it's this. If it's got private property, wage labor, the supremacy of market, concentration of the means of production, a profit motive, it's capitalism. That's what it's called. You know, there is no like in between or what, like different forms and hybrid. So in that sense, because degrowth stands against those institutions, I think calling capitalism is a bit confusing. The most interesting are not the misconceptions, which is just you can clear out, of the controversies. And well, I completely overshot that. So the controversies are what we can discuss. Of course, it's about the name being ugly and unsexy. It's about renunciation, living like a monkish life. It's about not being sufficient. Degrowthers don't talk much about population and immigration, so they're criticized on this side. It's about perhaps being like not having time for democracy. It's all nice to say we should develop collective autonomy, we should decolonize our imaginary, and then the IPC tells you 12 years. So here there's perhaps a bit of contradiction. It's also quite difficult to have in the same, this 12 years, we need to do something, so therefore perhaps we need strong state action to take power from corporations, which you cannot really attack as citizens. But then degrowth got this very anarchist thing of saying if the state is doing it, then they will never accept to decentralize power after this, the usual anarchist critique. There's this Keynesian critique I really like. You've heard about the Green New Deal. That basically says like, okay, degrowth, you say, it's a bigger role for the state to fight big corporation, to encourage commons, ta-da-da. But then you say you want to shrink the economy, so consume less, downshifting, ta-da-da, which means you also shrink state revenues, because most of, like a big chunk of state revenues relies on income tax, value-added tax. So you're saying you want a more powerful state, but then you're also starving the power of the state. There's the deep ecology critique, saying like, it's too anthropocentric, it relies too much on democracy and the setting of an agenda that is too human-focused. There's the good old Marxist critique. I think this was the first one and by far the biggest, of saying we're focusing on the wrong thing. And I think I get a lot of criticism of my work of just calling it growthism. It's about capitalism, Tim, they tell me. It's about capitalism and it's about classes. Degrowth, they don't talk about classes. It's not an opposition between the rich and the poor, the producer, the consumers, the employers and the employee. It's more subtle than this. And the Marxists argue it's problematic. What they argue is also like when you degrow, you get into this kind of snail, voluntary simplicity mode of lifestyles, which is kind of slowing down the ability to revolt. You know, in Marxist theory, at some point where the workers reach a point of overexploitation, it's shift, and then they take power from the state. This is the Marxist theory of change. And so from that perspective, some Marxists argue that degrowth is slowing down that process of revolution. That's like they wrote the accelerationist manifesto. Like, we don't need less exploitation, we need more exploitation now. So that we really hit the wall super fast, we revolt, take the power, do something else, start from scratch. Sexist and oppressive, okay, this one I've been developing. It did not really exist much, but that when you say we want to escape the economy and get back into society, a risk of doing this is that we fall back into patriarchal, non-economic exploitation. Because at least when you go to the economy, on the marketplace, you know, we trade around commodities, we have private property. Like, you could argue that this has been a means of emancipation for many women. I'm thinking here of labor market. I'm thinking also of the private property of what you produce that is not just for your household or working for someone else. It can become your own. So here it's the real challenge of decommodifying the economy without falling back on old and still prevalent patterns of gender-based oppression. The last one is this one. Wow, that's the business. It's a group of sociologists from the US. And I'm just going to, okay, I'll take a minute for this one. And they argue basically this. They say everything we value today, modern democracy, gender equality, the rule of law, education, was allowed and built on the basis of the exploitation of fossil fuels. This liberated the time we needed. They even go as far as argue that it is through the exploitation of nature that we could develop language in the first place. Otherwise, who would have time to write dictionaries and text or what? You would be plowing the field all time long, which is an argument which I think makes sense to some extent. And so they say, okay, guys, you want to exploit less of nature, but then you cannot have it all. If you want, a slower, less resources, less energy means less, how to call it, emancipatory institutions. It means the rule of law, democracy, all of this is going to be more difficult to maintain because all of those, they have an energy price tag. So that's the criticism I've been addressing, and it's we can discuss this too. I'm going to finish right now after that slide, which is another chapter of the thesis, which is quite exciting because I was like, okay, now I've done a history of degrowth, I've defined what it is, I've done the controversy analysis to see what it is not, the kind of the blurry contour of what degrowth is. Then I'm like, I think it's impossible, no concept is an island, and especially not degrowth. So I wanted to articulate degrowth, or at least map it out among the diversity of other alternative economy frameworks. So all the one you can see in that picture are utopias, you could say, or at least proposition of how to organize the economy differently. I've ranged them into the utopian bit, the one that are very subversive, and the one that either act as a legitimation of the system as it works today. So maybe you will recognize many names on the blue side, starting with sustainable development. Of course, from a degrowth perspective, which, as you remember, 2002, it started from a critique of development. So sustainable development for degrowthers is rather a sustaining of a specific mode of development rather than a new form of prosperity, which they criticize. I mean, SDG 8, if you know, is just a growth target, a big one. And if you go through the SDGs, which I did, and try to look for forms of extractivism, productivism, consumerism, you get it all over the place. So it's a subtle work, but I think it matters to use degrowth again as one of the radical end of the spectrum, as to be able to kind of contextualize things. I'm not saying that there is no point and no use for the SDGs. I'm just saying that it has value to know our spectrum and to have a diversity of options, because I think in the end of the day, I won't be arguing that degrowth is the best of all these frameworks. I'll be arguing, I think, that we need to have more ingredients to be able to do more recipes. And on the left side, I think one of the most interesting insight I took in my research was to learn more about Buen Vivir in South America, Ubuntu in Sub-Saharan Africa, and the economy of permanence in India, which are economic utopias, are subversive cosmologies that are as powerful as degrowth in Europe. So in that sense, it's more of a matter of just forming alliances, finding concept that works for specific regions. You can see Jen's framework is in there on the allies side, nothing too controversial. I think I may stop here because I've overshot completely. I think we can get back to discussions. You can ask as many questions as you want. And of course, at the end of the year, the full thesis will be available to you. Thank you very much for your attention.